Today we're answering a single question. How do we make an athlete 10% better? First and foremost, we have to break this down and determine, do we want this athlete to get 10% better in performance, or do we want this athlete to get 10% better in health? Let's go ahead and define our athlete real quick. Our athlete is going to be a pitcher. Our company, we focus specifically on pitching. And our athlete today is going to need arm health. So we're going to focus on determining how we can objectively look at his arm health, assess it, and help him create systems for the future. The reason why we're choosing arm health and focusing on it is because that's really what our company was founded on. Our company was built upon the backstory of my career. Back in 2010, I was supposed to be a first-round draft pick, and I missed it by about 60 days of Tommy John surgery. Reality is that forever altered not only my playing career, but then also my professional career in the future. I started asking the question, why? Why me? I traveled all around the country with that question, trying to figure out what makes up arm health. When we're looking at arm health, we're really evaluating three things: workload, strength, and mechanics. All three of those things, looked at objectively and measured, can help us gain insights at how to mitigate injury risk. So let's get into it today. Let's start talking about our athlete, how we're going to give him a system to help him mitigate injury risk. Today I'm going to be your guide as we go through workload, strength, and mechanics. We're going to tour KP and look at the products and the offerings that we have, the systems that we've designed to help us fully evaluate this KP3 philosophy. Let's check it out. So let's get started on our KP3 philosophy. We have workload, strength, and mechanics. When we talk about all three of these things, we're going to break them down by some questions today. So the first topic today is workload, and we're going to move in, and we're going to start with our first question. The first question is, how do we define workload? What is workload? This idea of workload and throwing. Reality is, when we talk about workload management, we're really talking about fatigue management. All that we're saying is we don't want our athlete to throw fatigued. We know, according to research, that there is a higher risk of injury for our athletes when they are throwing fatigued. We have to be able to look in deeper and evaluate the progression rate of the programming that we give our athlete. Is it too much, too quick, and fatiguing our athlete? Are we not preparing our athlete enough? Therefore, when they do receive that higher load in season, they're potentially fatiguing themselves as well. We need to make sure that we're progressing our athlete just right to be ready for season. So defining workload management really starts by saying it's fatigue management. We need to manage their fatigue. Reality is you're probably already a workload management expert and you didn't even know it. Let me prove it to you. So I like to talk about workload in the space of marathon running. So think about this. We got to build you up. Be ready for a marathon. Let's say you haven't trained at all. If you're like me, I love Chick-fil-A milkshakes, so I'm not ready to run a marathon today. However, if we look forward 6 months from now, I could probably train myself to be ready to run a marathon. Now, if you're like me, you'd start off, you'd go week 1, you maybe run half a mile or 1 mile, and you'd build your way up to maybe 2 miles or 1.5 miles. You have this nice progression rate from a little bit to just a little bit more. All of us sitting here, we would agree that if we went 1 mile in week 1 and then we ran 10 miles in week 2, 10 miles is probably going to be too much for us as an athlete right now who hasn't trained. There's a chance that I either get hurt or I'm going to be extremely fatigued. And when I go back to run again, potentially put myself at a higher risk of injury. We just know that innately, that we can't go from 1 mile to 10 miles. But in baseball today, we do that far too often. The number one recommendation from coaches when we talk about keeping an athlete healthy and or preparing them for the next season is to rest, take time off. Now, I'm not saying don't take time off. I'm saying that what we have to do is we have to look at our end goal, the next season. We have to determine, do I have enough time and what's the progression rate that I can go from where I'm at today to in season? And can I do it safely? Those are all questions that we have to look at objectively. And we have a pretty cool technology that I'd like to point out today. It's called the KP Sleeve. The KP Sleeve helps us track all of our throwing. It helps us objectively manage and determine how quick we should progress our athlete to be ready for season and how much our athlete actually needs to do to be ready for season. So now that we've defined workload, let's move on to our second question. Question that we get a lot. What's the difference between workload management and what we know today as pitch counts? Counts in and of themselves are a good thing, and we should look at them as being something that has been well intentioned for kids. However, there's a big issue. It's a glaring issue when we talk about pitch counts. There's a great study done by McWilliams and his team, and it shows all the pitches on a game day. So let's think about it like this for a second. Imagine I'm getting ready to throw today and I have a game. I'm going to have the pitches that I throw against a hitter in that game. I'm going to have the pitches in between innings, and then I'm going to have the bullpen pitches that I throw before the game. McWilliams and his team took inventory on all of these different types of pitches and looked at the average amounts of each of these pitches. What we saw was that 57% of all the pitches in a game day were pitches that we threw to hitters, pitch counts. So the problem, though, is we're not accounting for the bullpen pitches, or we're not accounting for the pitches in between innings. We're also not accounting for long toss before the game, and McWilliams' team didn't even look at that. We're not accounting for plyo-care throws, which a lot of kids today have very long plyo-care programs. We're not accounting for all the games that they played another position in that day, and we need to. So how do we do that? How do we task that? When we're looking at 50% or maybe less than 50% of a game day's volume or intensity, and we're trying to make decisions moving forward to the next games, we start to have a problem. We start to realize that we're not making real educated decisions. What about practice days before a game day? Going back to my marathon example, what happens if you run a marathon the day before a marathon? That doesn't make any sense. So what about the practice days before the game? What if we do too much in those practice days and we fatigue ourselves in? We just don't know by not objectively quantifying all the throws in a game day or all the throws in a season. We need to mark and manage all of these throws. So with it being clear that pitch counts obviously don't work the way that workload management does in managing every day's throw, the question becomes, how do we manage workload every day for our throwing athletes? And this is our third question. How do we manage our athletes on a day-to-day basis with workload management? So at KP, we have a 3-part process that we go through in terms of managing our athletes on a daily basis with throwing workload. The first thing that we do is we assess. The second thing that we do is we program. And the third thing that we do is we coach. So let me walk through each of those a little bit and explain them in a little more detail. So from the assessment side of things, it's vital that we go through our daily process and we understand where our athletes are when they walk into the facility in terms of fitness. We don't want to prescribe our athletes too much. We don't want to prescribe our athletes too little, as we mentioned before. So in terms of getting it just right in terms of the next step, programming, we have to assess our athletes. That means that we have to track throws from our athletes on a day-to-day basis, dating back over the last month. This is pretty easy to do with technology, and luckily in-house we have the KP sleeve. We've been now building this sleeve for the last couple of years to help us evaluate our athletes better. We wanted more accuracy. We wanted a smoother process, and the KP sleeve allows tracking throwing on a day-to-day basis to be seamless. So we bring in data from our athletes, from their sleeve to their app, the Connect app, and it gets streamed to us as coaches so that I can look on our dashboard and make recommendations to that athlete, understanding and assessing where they're at coming in daily. Has this athlete been doing too much? Maybe this athlete hasn't been doing enough. Maybe this athlete's fitness level's too low. Maybe this athlete's fitness level is a little too high for their projection of their program. We need to start by tasking goals and looking at the assessment process to figure out where are you today and where are your goals for the future so we can build you a proper program. Now that leads me to my second point here, which is programming. We build programs completely individualized to each and every athlete. Lucky for us, through the Connect app, again, we're able to individualize the long-term programming for the athlete. That means we account for things like, is this athlete a starter or is he a reliever? Is this athlete younger or older? Does this athlete want to throw 4 days a week or 7 days a week? We can intake all of that information, and based upon their fitness level from the assessment, we can drop them into a program and help them create the long-term vision for that athlete to get them into season healthy. If you think about it again, going back to our marathon context, our athletes have to be ready for the marathon at the start of the season in terms of throwing. So we have to build them up to be ready for that marathon over time. With proper programming and proper assessing, this means that we can individualize that process to the athlete, predicated upon things like vacation schedule or training schedule. And we can individually create that readiness for that athlete, that fitness level for that athlete before a season starts. Then the last part, maybe my favorite part, is coaching. At KP, we've been so lucky to have such great athletes over the last 5 years. Our language, workload management has become a language to us. We speak in terms of one-day workload. So we'll tell a kid, hey, you have a 10 one-day workload today. And that kid knows he can have some autonomy to choose what he wants to do around that value, around that work for the day. Our app specifies this, and it allows the user to come in and learn more detail around what is a one-day workload. It's super easy. Once you fall into the process, you follow the app's user interface appropriately, and you're going to end up making sure that you're allotted the right amount of throwing on a day-to-day basis. So from a coaching standpoint, I'm just communicating to my athlete, telling him what I want on a daily basis, and he's able to execute appropriately. We're able to work together on the schedule as things happen. Look, life happens with our athletes, and we need to be able to prepare for it. So if we move from assess to program to then coach, me being a coach, I'm able to communicate with my athlete around objective data that matters. And this is the power of the KP sleeve through the Connect app. So looking at big picture of how we implement at KP, again, we're focused on those three things: assess, program, and coach. With that, hopefully it brings context to how we utilize workload management in the KP3 philosophy to allow us insight to our athletes. To learn more about workload management, you can visit us online. Check out our educational materials at ConnectEDU at kineticprobaseball.com. Let's take the next step in our KP3 journey and move on to strength, where I'm going to bring in our strength coach, Garrett Phelps, the mad scientist, to help us out and to understand what is strength in our KP3 philosophy. Garrett Phelps, what's up?
What's up?
Not much. All right. Let's talk about strength today. Our KP3 model, we're trying to break down and understand the differences between workload, strength, and mechanics. You're the director of strength. You're the expert of strength. You're the mad scientist. Give me a little breakdown on strength. What is strength?
Strength, simply put, is injury resilience. An injury happens when applied force is greater than tissue tolerance. So the applied force is the stress that we put on the body either on the mound or in the weight room. Our tissue tolerance is ability to manage that stress so we don't become injured.
Awesome. So when we think about this, in strength, we have two categories: arm care, and we have like strength conditioning. Help me understand the difference between the two. It seems like they're kind of both one and the same in this category. Maybe I'm a little confused. Let's break it down and maybe bring some clarity.
Yeah, so let's define those two. So strength and conditioning is the general preparedness of the athlete's body to handle the skill of the sport. Arm care is specifically targeted exercise to the specific throwing shoulder of that athlete.
So when we look at understanding, I guess, a structure like an organization, for example, they have PTs and ATs, and they have, strength conditioning coaches. They have other individuals whose job is to basically develop strength. Are you saying that all of their approach should be potentially the same, or are you saying that their focuses are maybe different? How would you define maybe those roles, or would you just say that they're all kind of working for the same goal?
Yeah, so an AT, PT, a chiropractor, a strength coach, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to build strength or injury resilience of the athlete to allow the athlete to participate in their sport longer without interruptions or injuries.
Love that. So help me understand. I talked about in workload a 3-part process. I talked about the assess, I talked about the program, and then I talked about coaching and the value of all three. I know in this model, whether it be arm care or strength conditioning, we have those three. So let's kind of talk as an overview. Tell me more about assess. How do you look at assess when we talk about arm care and strength?
Yeah, so the most important thing about assessment is it has to be daily, because it allows us to see where the athlete is at readiness-wise, either on the mound or in the weight room.
So from there, we then move into programming, I assume. And tell me more about programming, because if you're saying that we're looking at somebody assessing daily, we have to be able to provide individualized programming based off that daily assessment. Is that how it works?
Yeah, so programming here is going to be dynamic training protocol based off of those scores that we see from that daily assessment. So the program itself is going to change day to day based off of those scores that we see from the assessment process.
I know that happens in our bands module. I know that happens in Connect through the app. Does that happen in our strength conditioning program as well?
Yeah, it does.
Interesting. So I know there's some uniqueness around how we've designed these things through Connect. Talk to me more about, let's talk about the bands a little bit. Age range, different types of movement qualities, different set rep schemes, tempos. Talk to me a little bit more about how we designed some of that.
Yeah. So with the bands, we have age. So younger athletes are going to have easier exercise to perform because they can execute those exercises better because they don't have that heightened sense of awareness. As like the older guys, they have a better awareness of their body, so they can handle higher skill level exercises and execute them to higher demands. It's also going to be older athletes, stronger athletes are going to have higher band tensions with more sets, more reps, higher tempos, whereas younger guys are going to have lower of all those because they can't handle that as much because they're not physically developed as much as the old guys are.
And then going back to our assess side of things to drive the point home, I know you said that changes based upon the DTP, the programming side of things, right? So when we go from the assess to then the program, you're saying that the program for that athlete, that set rep scheme, tempo, tension, even though it's higher for an older athlete, does that always stay the same?
No, it's going to change daily based off of their TISO score or a singular score for that day. And it allows the athlete to progress from the shoulder standpoint or the arm care standpoint without fatiguing muscles that are already fatigued.
So for our athlete that we're looking at in terms of this case, where we're trying to get him 10% better in terms of arm health, monitoring, measuring to the assess side of things, giving him individualized programming is going to benefit him. What's the last piece? It's coaching. Talk to me about how coaching plays factor into this as well.
So from the coaching side of things, it's the most important thing is getting the most out of the athlete, communicating with the athlete, and encouraging the athlete to get the most out of their training so they can see the results that they ultimately want.
So Garrett, to wrap it up, we're looking at assess, meaning that we're going to evaluate that athlete on a daily basis. So in this case, our athlete who we're trying to change, give him arm health, help him understand that process and build 10% more arm health. He's got to, number one, assess daily, right? Second point is that we want a dynamic training protocol at DTP. We want to be able to provide him the right amount of stimulus daily, is what you're saying. And then third, we need great coaching around him to encourage him, to build him, to continue to push him, to get the most out of him on a day-to-day basis, to make sure that he's encouraged as well as coached through the process to getting the most out of that DTP. I think the interesting thing here that I know I've watched you build over time here is that strength and conditioning module on the Connect app. I know it's not available publicly yet, except for through our remote training, our in-house training. I know you've talked about 2023 being the release date for that DTP model on strength and conditioning, showcasing how we've come to managing, monitoring, and evaluating overall fatigue in athletes in our training protocols. Pretty cool. So really excited to see that. That'll be in Connect EDU as well. Garrett Phelps, the mad scientist, the one and only director of KP Strength. Appreciate your time. We're going to bounce it over to KP Biomechanics to wrap it up today for our KP3 philosophy. So we've been through workload, strength, and now we're moving into mechanics. To begin with mechanics, let's start off by defining it. Let's understand what we mean by mechanics. When we're talking about the teaching of mechanics, we're talking about two different things. There's biomechanics, which is the objective measure of movement. And then we're talking about the oral tradition, meaning that somebody experienced something or somebody was taught something a while back and it got handed down generation to generation to the next players in line to understand and comprehend exactly how we do this thing of our skill, pitching. Today, we're going to talk about biomechanics, the objective measure. What we want to understand is we want to understand the total work that the body has to do. And to do this, we're going to use objective measure. To get a little bit deeper definition, I have a good clip from my friend Dr. Mike Son explaining how he defines biomechanics. Give me a little rundown on, what is biomechanics?
Biomechanics, kind of in the broadest definition, is looking at the physics of motion and the forces and movement patterns that people get into.
So breaking that down a little bit further, I know I've heard these terms of kinematics and kinetics in biomechanics, right? How do we define, what's the difference between those and how does that help us kind of continue on in this definition?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at biomechanics, we group our descriptions into kinetics, and kinetics are forces. So they're things like pounds, kilograms, Newton meters. It's the forces that are acting on the body. The kinematics are the joint angles. They're the joint angles, they're the joint velocities, and they're the descriptions of the motion. So we get into things like displacement, velocity, acceleration, those types of descriptions of motion. And those two things work together because typically faster movement will lead to higher forces. But it's those two descriptions, and that's really how we break all of biomechanics down.
So for me as a coach, when I look at a player and I'm evaluating a player, so I've typically worked off, again, my eyes and my history within the game and my experience. I'm trying to usually get a guy to throw harder, right? Or stay healthy, and we want to put him in better positions to potentially stay healthy or help him understand performance and what it takes to throw harder. How would I use those two? What would be some examples of like how I would use those two to look into both of those realms?
Fundamentally, when we are talking about evaluating the biomechanics of pitching, we are looking at two goals: health and performance. Ultimately, your health doesn't so much matter if you don't have the performance because you're not around to enjoy it, right? So we're constantly trying to get our pitchers to throw harder, to throw more innings, to build up their workload. When you start increasing velocity, you start increasing forces on the joints. And that's basic physics right there. When you're looking at how efficient or how effective a pitcher's movement is, what we're typically looking at is that we would expect there's a certain increase in forces as their performance and their velocity goes up. But you can get into different positions and have different mechanics or different postures that are associated with having less stress. So if you have two pitchers that are both throwing 95 miles an hour and one of them's putting 85 Newton meters of stress on their arm and the other one's putting 75 Newton meters of stress on their arm, we look at that guy with the lower stress as being a more efficient pitcher. So it's really trying to optimize the efficiency and reduce the stress while maintaining the performance. And that's kind of the overall goal of understanding pitching biomechanics.
So as Mike states, our focus when we talk about health and mechanics is reducing stress in the thrower so that the overall work of the day is less on that thrower. Influencing mechanics can be tough. In this next clip, I talk a little bit about how our process at KP works as we move from assess, feel, to drill to teach mechanics and make change.
From the very beginning, the assessment, we got to understand, can this athlete do this thing that we're asking them to do? Kind of look in deeper and find out where their limitations are. Secondarily, we have to be able to educate them or help them feel that thing, right? So we have assessment or assess, then feel. So walking that athlete through, understanding the key variables that are in that field component, understand the timing at which these things are supposed to happen. And then lastly, like you're talking about, constrain them, put them through a constraint drill, help them feel those positions, go from most constrained to least constrained, and hopefully transfer that over to the mound and see a change in that kinematic sequence. I love this idea. Mike and I have talked about this a number of times. It's, always going through this full circle, having a system where we build this full circle, right? We start off somewhere, we go through, we evaluate, with the kinematic sequence, go through, evaluate, then continue down the journey, then come back to that kinematic sequence again, begin the journey all over again in that process.
So to wrap things up here, when we objectively look at assessment, we can begin to understand the actual change we're making through feels and drills. We're not just making up exercises, not just making up drills to spend time with the athlete. We're actually looking at what brings change, what is applicable. I want to make note that we did put mechanics third on our hierarchy list in the KP3 philosophy. It's workload, strength, then mechanics. And some may ask why. It's important to note that when we talk about stress of the thrower, we're talking about a single throw. Athletes who throw harder or athletes who have a lower arm slot are more highly susceptible to higher stresses. So when we look at this, we have to realize that it's not a single throw that causes the injury. It's the repetition of that high stress over time. Again, looking at workload first, workload allows us to manage how much we're doing in a day, how much stress we're accumulating, how much our body's working. Somebody like Chris Sale is a great example of this. I think we can all agree we would take Chris Sale's career any day of the week. But Chris throws from a lower slot, and he throws very hard. So Chris is a higher stress pitcher. So the question becomes, when we look at somebody like Chris Sale, how do we improve their odds of having a long duration career and having success? Chris in high school moved from a higher arm slot to a lower arm slot. This is one of the things that he attributes to his great success as an MLB pitcher. So when we look at this now, we have to evaluate, maybe we don't want to change his mechanics. Again, that's our third thing. We know he's going to be high stress, but our workload and then building a great foundation of strength for Chris is going to provide injury resilience. Managing that workload, managing that strength allows us to look at our mechanics as a third piece to our puzzle. Going back to our athlete now who wants to get 10% better in health, to close this out today, we would provide them the KP3 philosophy to hopefully change their career.